Hey everyone, welcome to Trailblaze Your Path. I'm very excited to be interviewing Brian Kramer. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Kaylee.
Yeah, and like I was saying, this is perfect timing to interview you as I rebrand the podcast because I've been following you for a while and I really believe that you're a trailblazer in our industry. And you just have such great insight. I feel like you speak well, you have such value to add. And so I'm excited to interview
I've
you.
bumped my head quite a few times, so I know a lot of ways not to do things.
Well, that's how we learn, right?
Yes, that is. You
Yeah.
learn more from that than you do from winning.
Yes, exactly. And it's not really failing, when we go down that path. It's as long as we learn from it and improve, we're winning. So,
I wish more people looked at the world like that.
yeah, it would be nice, right?
It would.
I want to talk to you about just, you've been with where you're at for 2 years now, coming from most of, I think your career is in the dealers and you switched over to the other side, the vendor side, or the vendor partner side, if you want to call it that. So how has that been switching over from dealer world to vendor?
It's been really educational in many different ways that I didn't even think about. But there's a lot of dealers that I go into and I see these very innovative, trailblazing type of processes and people doing things in very unique ways, with the theme talking about parts or fixed ops, different way that people are using accessories or the way that people are doing remote service with offsite vehicles and hanging parts and what kind of parts they put on these mobile service vans and the two different levels of this mobile service vans and things that I was just starting to get into in retail, right before I left, and being able to see how well everybody does, and then also how much opportunity there still is, because it drives me crazy. I was in retail for 27 years, but the last 2 years I was we had gone paperless in sales and variable side, and I was really honing in. Not everybody enjoyed it on the fixed op side because I'm picking away at every aspect of how we did everything and trying to question everything, including myself, and trying to figure out why do we do this and why do we do this and why do we do this. And
Wait,
as
I
I
want to ask you
go,
something.
please.
Questioning, so how was that when you were questioning your fixed ops team? Because I feel like most of the time GMs come from variable, and if you come over there on the fixed ops side, they're going to be like, "Who's this guy questioning us?" So how was that experience? Because I feel like there's a right way to do it. You're questioning to learn and improve. You're not questioning them by like you're doing it all wrong, right? I'm assuming that's how it went.
Of course, but even by questioning it and saying, why do we do it this way? Help me understand, walk me through with a thought process. And I think so many people are so busy sawing that they never stop to sharpen the blade. And really in fixed, as you know, there's no time to really do that. And I feel like I mean, here's what I learned. And my fixed ops director, she went away for, I don't know, a little over a week. So I moved into fixed ops and I just tried to understand everything and see the flow of everything,
Yeah.
because we could sell a car in 45 minutes, but we couldn't change oil in an hour. And a lot of it had to do with paperwork and the disjointed systems that weren't communicating with each other. And I really wanted to streamline that and be able to, if a client wanted to do something like Jiffy Lube. But what I started realizing is the inefficiencies, which I still don't think are fixed to this day. I mean, there's certain places like Bozard Ford and Ed Roberts and these unicorns. But for the most part, what I had learned, and we wrote, I don't know, before I left, probably 5,000 ROs a month, CP and warranty, and then
Wow.
we had our internals.
Yeah.
But, and we took it from like 2,800, that we did it like in a matter of 3 years.
Wow.
But it wasn't, as we started getting more and more efficient, I started realizing that it's kind of like bleeding the bubbles out of brake lines. We had that same capacity there the whole time. But here's the things that I noticed as we were coming through that. So we have the intake and the appointment comes in. And as I would listen to phone calls, somebody would say, hey, I need to get a price on tires. So instead of asking one more question or really trying to understand or trying to train our BDC or our ASMs on how to handle that, they would say, no problem. They would connect them with parts. Yeah, I need to get a price on tires. And what they were really asking is, I want to get 4 tires installed, but the customer doesn't know what to ask, right? So I think deciphering that, there's areas of opportunity even with AI to do that.
And then the
Because
parts guy is probably like, we don't have tires.
well, they quote without labor, right? And they'd
Yeah.
say, okay, well, can I come in and can I set an appointment to get those installed? Well, we don't do that. I'd have to connect you with the service advisor. When
Yeah.
they go to the service advisor, oh, you want parts? And then they flip them back. And I think asking one more question, but The other thing that I could go on ad nauseum, but the other thing I noticed is we have a client, the client calls up and they want tires, and they just assume that the ASM knows well, I bought my car there. I bought my last 7 cars there. You guys don't know what kind of tires are on my car? Or because they would say, well, do you have an 18-inch wheel or a 19-inch wheel? Well, can't you just look that up? And they think that every ASM has access to be able to pull build sheets and their original, and why wouldn't we know how to do that? And really, in theory, it should integrate. But the other interesting thing is we're generating out 150 ROs, appointments on ROs a day out of, let's say, 200 or more. As they come in, then let's say it's a Camry, they assume that we're going to have the tires in stock. And not all the time did we have every 20-inch Highlander wheel in stock. So then we try to upsell them. Well, what do you mean you don't have the tires in stock? You knew I was coming. I scheduled this appointment 2 weeks ago. And so I started asking all the advisors, I'm like, how is this even possible? And then I started going back to the parts department. And as I started, everybody's like, what is he doing back here all the time? But I realized at 3 o'clock, everybody stopped working in the parts department.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, you guys are here till 5:30. What are we doing? Like in the sales department, you're constantly pushing activity, right? And they go, what else do you want us to do? I go, I want you to, let's pre-pull parts for tomorrow morning. And I go, we got all the appointments in the system. Well, we don't have access to X time. Well, why don't you have access to X time?
Yeah.
You know what? We know what's coming in tomorrow. Well, because that doesn't update in the DMS until the morning. And then we pre-pull them first thing in the morning. We come in early to do that. And I go, but you guys are sitting here idle for 2 hours. So there's things like that that are like such a crazy dichotomy to me. And I think not enough GMs spend enough time in fixed ops to be able to see those things. So then at the end of my career, I just kept asking them, how do I make this better? Because I didn't know, but I knew that they did. And I'm like, what else could we do? And they're like, well, what? I don't even know what's possible. And I'm like, well, if this was the magic beans and you could fix this and you could write it the way you want it to look, how would we fix it? And then started getting the best ideas in the world from our frontline parts associates. And they go, well, we could do this and and they started coming up with the solutions. And I think that's what more people need to be doing right now is figuring those things out.
Absolutely. I think GMs, the best stories I hear is either a GM or a dealer was kind of forced into filling in their fixed ops. Like you wanted to, but your person was out. So you filled in. I have a story where a dealer, he had to fill in for his parts manager because he couldn't find anyone. He was in a small town. He never wants to go back, but he got a realization of like, wow, this is really what's going on. And you just don't know until you go back there, I feel like. So that's a good point.
Well, the other thing that happens too is like I had a really strong fixed operations director, and she and I have known each other for 20 something years. So if I was going back there, she's assuming, she goes, do you not trust me to do my job?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it wasn't that. I was trying to understand it.
Yeah. So, but I think that's the biggest problem. Like when I talk to a dealer, I talked to one recently where her parts manager has been there for 30 years and she never really was back there because they had trust and it was good. So how do you go back there without putting in that like this lack of trust? Because you're not having lack of trust. I don't know. Back in the day when I worked at Subway, I always loved when my owner came in and actually worked with us because I'm like, now you're seeing all this shit I'm bitching about. Like, come on,
Right.
fix this.
Right. And I think that, it's like undercover boss, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But the boss is there.
And I think the ASMs a lot of times are also guarded, or the parts advisors. They're like, maybe you should talk to her and ask, because at the same time, I respect that they don't want, they're tight and they trust her and they don't know where I'm going with this. So I think that GMs, if you are going on that, is to make it clear you're not on a witch hunt. You're there to remove obstacles and roadblocks and be sincere, authentic, and really curious instead of trying to like a gotcha moment. And I don't think that everybody does it with the sincere and authenticity part of it. I think a lot of them are looking for a shoe to drop, and you got to be okay with the fact that everything's not perfect, and it's a lot less perfect and variable normally than what it is in fixed ops. But you make one or two little changes, and you make everybody's life a little bit easier. Like for instance, we narrowed it down that one of the biggest problems that we had was MA001, that op code, because if everything wasn't set up prior to that in all the appointment systems and everything else, that was the workaround, right? Okay, it's not in our service or parts pricing system. So MA0 miscellaneous 001 would allow us to do that, and then we'll deal with it later. So the whole assembly line after that happens, as you know, everything was affected by it, because now you got to do manual lookups and everything there. It's like you took the autopilot off. And why? Because nobody wants to stop and sharpen the blade enough. So you're sawing with a dull blade, and it makes everybody's life so much harder.
Yeah, that's a good point because they're just going through it that they don't have time to really stop, but they know what needs to change is just taking that time and then having a GM or someone going back there to really help support and like, hey, let's take a minute and let's sharpen the blade. That's a good point. I want to talk to you about because we were talking a little bit just the kind of the parallels because I had mentioned every time I hear you talk on Clubhouse or wherever you're speaking, when you talk about used cars, and that's the one thing I'm always talking about to dealers. I'm like, it's just your used cars are just like your parts department. And I just want to I don't even know what question I want to ask you. I just want to know just kind of like your perspective because you know both sides. How can you translate it to like for them to look at parts the same way, the same mindset? It's the same thing.
So there was a time back in 2007 or 8, and I knew that I didn't know what I needed to know about parts and service. And I went to this, I think it was an NCM boot camp or whatever Mercedes sent me to, or Cadillac actually sent me there, General Motors. And I met Lloyd Schiller and opened up my eyes up to this whole other thing. And I had always been told, look, forget it. Don't worry about fixed operations. You know, that's going to do what it's going to do. You just worry about selling cars. But I know I needed that in order to really round myself out. So I ended up paying Lloyd myself to basically come there for a week. And he just shadowed, I just shadowed him, and we walked around, and everywhere I went, he went. And we went down to the shop, and he would sit there and explain, this is why this is, and this is why this is. And then I worked with, when I was at AutoNation, I worked with a guy named Jim Kubisak, who runs the number one, the biggest wholesale parts operation in the world for AutoNation in Clearwater, Florida. And I was able to pick his brain because we worked at the same, I was GM over the whole property, right?
Oh, okay.
And so as I was able to pick his brain, and I'm talking about they've got 96 trucks, 3 semis, they have 96 routes. They cover from Alabama to Miami and everywhere in between.
That's amazing.
And then each person, there was 270 parts employees out of that distribution warehouse.
That's a
It opened
real,
at 4 a.m. and closed at 11 p.m.
Wow.
And all makes, all models. It's an amazing operation. So between the two of those, I guess here's my summary. And I wish somebody would have explained this to me earlier, because I think it takes a lot of the intimidation out of it on both sides, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with off-the-shelf fill rate. Off-the-shelf fill rate is the equivalent of a used car stocking guide. So are you stocking the right parts? Are you stocking the right cars? Are you stocking the ones that turn the quickest? So like earlier when David Spizak is saying you need to go after the most desirable vehicles with the lowest market day supply, with the highest demand, that are going to turn the fastest. And if you stock the right parts or the right cars, you don't have to worry about obsolescence, which is aging in used cars. It's all the same. So you're not going to have any obsolescence issues. And in the same way that you have parts buckets in the parts department, you've got vehicle aging buckets.
Yeah.
But the smarter you are at inventory management and not ordering stuff that you don't need, or not keeping stuff that you don't need, which is really the difference between most parts departments and used car departments, is that used car departments are overly optimistic with their inventory.
Yeah.
Parts managers are realistic. So they stock what they need, and they get out of what it's kind of like playing poker. They want to get out of the hand as quickly as possible of a bad hand so that they can play another good hand. Used car manager thinks they can win every hand, and they don't look at it like that.
So true.
Because their intuition. Parts pad variance at the end of the month. The parts manager is like, okay, this is what we thought we were. This is where we actually are. A used car manager will say, we've got a 60-day aging policy. Well, how many cars do you have over 60? So you have 0? No, we've got a lot of cars over 60. So in parts, it's more of a policy, and in used cars, it's more of a guideline, I would say.
That makes sense. And I don't know that much about you. So like, obviously you can't return like if you make a bad decision, you can't return that car. You just try to get rid of it. But with parts.
No, but you can't.
Okay.
You can return it or you can take it to the auction.
Yeah.
And get
that's a
out of it quickly. And like your first loss is often your best loss.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But most don't do that.
Yeah. Well, so that's the kind of when you translate it over to parts, when you make that bad decision or you don't need those parts or you just have all these parts that you shouldn't have, your DMS is showing you shouldn't have these parts, you can return them and put them or get rid of them. I don't know. Depending on the manufacturer, it's all different.
And a restocking fee is similar to wholesale loss.
That
There's
makes
going to
sense.
be
Yeah.
some sort of expense, and
Yep.
it's a lot less than what it is,
Holding
once
it
it's
on.
not eligible. Yeah.
Holding on to it. Yep. Yeah, no, I know that because I know with GM, they call it like a CSO 11 return where you have a restocking fee. I know all of them have that, but it just makes more sense. Why would you carry and hold this part for however long their parameters are, 16 months? And
And
yeah,
and just like with General Motors RIM program,
yeah,
you've also got CPO programs. So the more vehicles that you stock. So for instance, Mercedes-Benz C3 program or BMW's Full Circle CPO program are very similar to RIM in that way. And I know each one has its own, but GM RIM is typically the one that's most popular.
and we'll
What
clarify, RIM or Arrow, that's an auto stock replenishment program, just so everyone knows.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the below the line money or the rebates that come back on that are also similar to how many cars do you buy from the manufacturer, they can pay you, or how many cars you buy from the auction. There's also money that comes back to the dealer, which might not affect everybody, but there is a holdback, if you will, that comes back in. With Mercedes-Benz, the more cars that you buy off lease or CPO eligible vehicles, the more it also doesn't just affect a dollar amount, it also affects your new car your margin. So there's multiple layers to it. But just like with RIM, the more volume that you're doing, the bigger that pot of money is.
Yes. Yeah. And you have to be really careful with that, right? Because, that when you're incentivized, you can overstock, right?
Yeah,
Similar to parts, you can
exactly.
overstock yourself. Yeah. Wow. There's just so much.
And you're paying more for a CPO eligible car, especially from an off lease provider, just like General Motors, like for instance, in a big wholesale parts warehouse, I forget how much it was. I can't say how much money it was making, but it was wildly profitable at
Yeah.
only like a 15% margin on wholesale parts, which is still not, it's still pretty good, especially in the volume that they do.
Yeah.
But
For
the
whole.
interesting thing is I was trying to go after aftermarket parts, right?
Oh.
And I'm like, well, instead of, let's say for round numbers, me, this is at the Toyota store, instead of me paying my parts department 35%, let's say for internals, if they went with an aftermarket part on a car that was out of warranty, I would pay them 45 or 50% because I wanted to encourage a higher margin, but with a lower cost of sale on older cars, I was still making out better. The problem is, as you know, with RIM, when you start not achieving the tire targets and you start going with other off brands, it could affect that dollar amount could be astronomical of what you're missing out on. The same thing happens with if you're not buying enough of your OEM vehicles, you're going to lose out on all that money. So it's actually the same.
Yeah, it is the same. But why is it that we're, I don't know the right way to say it, like afraid of the parts department? Is it because the person typically is there for 30, 40 years and they're doing good and you just don't really question anything? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, no, it's, having been a general manager and knowing a lot of them, I'll just say, and it's not like this in every single situation,
No.
but most GM's egos are too big to admit that they don't know something. So they don't, it's kind of a foreign concept. It's something they're not familiar with. So they don't ask those questions, which is what leads to, what, we're paying way too much for internal parts or internal labor. We need to discount the labor rate or discount the parts rate. And in most cases, just for any variable GMs or GSMs that are or used car managers listening to this call, you're much better off paying your parts department a higher margin and go asking them to find lower cost parts. Overall, you're going to make more money and save more money on the RO than you ever could by taking them from 35 to 25% or 20%. That's so nominal and it's minimal compared to what you could get with an aftermarket water pump versus an OEM water pump or something like that. If I could go back in time, I wish somebody would have told me that because everybody always says, "Oh, look at this average cost per RO. This is crazy." Well, most of it is because you're only buying OEM parts. And as I talk to my parts team, and I'm like, "Well, hey, what about this one on eBay or this?" And well, I had an FJ Cruiser that I customized, and everything that I wanted was some off the wall thing that I wanted to put on this thing with the upper control arms, lower control arms, and they said, "Are you sure you don't want to just go with the OEM part?" I go, "I don't want the OEM part. I want it to be unique and I want it to be for off-road." And they said, well, it's just so much harder if it's not in our system. And I said, is that the reason why you guys don't want to go with aftermarket parts? And they go, absolutely. It's so much more difficult versus just being in our ordering system. And I'm like, okay, so I'm trying to fix this. That everybody's under this perception that parts is trying to upcharge them and make all this money, when in actuality, it's just another example of friction in the process, that there's more friction to go with aftermarket parts than there is to go with OEM parts.
Yeah. And you can't assume, like, they assumed you wanted the manufacturer, the OEM parts. You can't assume that, especially if the car is 10 plus years old.
Yes. And that's a huge thing, because ordering Michelin's, because that's what we put on the CPO cars, is not what you should be putting on a 10-year-old car. And there should be, in my mind, we defined what should a CPO car get on the top 4 or 5 core models. So like at our store, it was Salium tires. And Salium tires, I could get 4 for $500 versus 4 Michelin's for $1,200. So immediately the average RO is going down, and I'm getting the same tread depth. It's approved for CPO standards. And there's typically, as you know, 4 different tires that are there.
Yeah.
And most everybody says, well, it needs to be certified. It's got to be, but there's also different levels of tires. There's different everything when it comes to that.
Tires a whole nother, yeah.
Right.
And you also have to look at the vehicle too. Like for yours, you're going to want more of an off-road vehicle or off-road tire, and you're going to want to probably pay a little bit more for a better tire. Whereas if it's just a daily driver, sometimes you don't really want to pay so much. I don't know. That's my perspective.
Yeah. No, and everybody would say, well, you don't want a rough ride. I'm like, I really don't care about a rough ride because that's not what we're using it for.
Exactly.
But everybody always assumes, well, you're going to want this because you don't want all they're going to be chopped and you don't want all that noise on the highway. And I'm like, well, I've already got it because I've got a roof rack that's singing like a canary. But yeah, so asking those questions I think is critical.
Yeah, really, really is. But I did want to go back to, and then I wanted to switch it up a little bit. I think it does boil down to pay plans and how they're structured, and they're kind of like that guide to get people and everyone working together. And it's a really challenging thing there's just no structure, I feel like, or that's not the right word. There's just no standard. Is that the right way to say it?
That is the right word.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no standard. Yeah.
And it comes with pay plans, and it comes with other things. Like for instance, in our store, when I would look at it on a 12-month rolling average, we would average, in used cars, like 30 Highlanders, 40 used RAV4s, and I'm talking 0 to 3-year-old vehicles every single month.
Okay.
So for the longest time, we didn't always have, we're like, well, yeah, but you guys sold a ton of CPO RAV4s. I'm like, right, but for the most part, it's within 5 units every month. We kind of can predict the future as to this is how many RAV4s we're going to sell. This is how many Highlanders we're going to sell. This is how many Camrys we're going to sell. Mm-hmm. So why don't we, knowing that, already have those parts in stock?
Yeah.
In addition to the CP work, so that we're prepared for that, because we're also targeting those vehicles on the service drive. We know we're going to take them in. Mm-hmm. So we should never have to wait on those or have a customer come back because of that, which obviously, we fixed all that. But it's also, well, all we had was Michelin, so I put Michelin's on that were twice as much or 3 times as much as the Dunlops were, or whatever the switch tires are. That also is another big thing, because you could have the right size tires, but not the right make. And now you're paying twice as much. And then they say, we're paying parts way too much. We need to cut the parts labor or the parts markup, which is not the answer.
No, it's not. And I did want to touch on, but we're kind of like running into time. There's so much to talk about. Just like we didn't even really talk about recon process and all of that with kind of. So
that's a hot topic.
That is a hot topic. So I guess I want to get your perspective. Like what are dealerships struggling with? How can they overcome it? And what's the problem with recon? That's a big question.
Well, so this is one of these things that I've learned as I travel around, right? And I was always trying to get to 3 to 5 days. We traveled somewhere in between there. And I ended up putting out back, I think that there should be visual representation. I think the best dealerships have big signs at the end of their trade rows. Okay. And they actually have visual representation. They write down the date on the windshield when they take the car in. And I'm going old school, but with a grease pencil, and you do a T-bar, what's the date? Is it CPO? Is it as is? Mm-hmm. What's the inspection? What recon's already approved? so that everybody can start working on that 7 o'clock in the morning. But ideally, they're also still writing up until 5 o'clock the previous day, and getting those tickets into parts so we can at least start pulling that stuff. The parts, there's a parts liaison that's on those trade walks that knows to start getting those vehicles. Having the recon team having a cage out there with fast moving parts and oil changes, their oil filters and the oil and brake pads and that sort of thing for those vehicles like that, the tires that we were just talking about. But then knowing every single day as you walk through there, is it pending? Has it been written up? Has the RO been opened? Is it pending a parts hold? Is there a recall stop sale on it? Is it pending detail? What I've found out in most of the dealerships I've worked at is that everybody always talks about, well, my average recon's 7 days or 5 days, but they don't chunk it down into, is it detail? Is it parts? Is it service because we don't have enough technicians? We're not distributing the work. Are we, constantly putting CP work ahead of everything else? Not prioritizing the work, and we're taking all the tough jobs that have crazy dash work and that need windshields replaced.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it kind
heads
of
up displays?
Yeah, doesn't it kind of boil down to like the shop efficiency? Like who is managing that flow and looking at like ahead of like what do we
Yes.
have on the schedule? Because I don't know if I don't want to put everyone in the same category, but I feel like most of the time fixed ops is like, oh, these sales guys, they want this, this car so they can sell it, and they just push it off because they're like they don't care about sales. So
Well, and they also, I think they think that work's going to be there, which it is, right?
well, yeah, but
And
then
if
maybe that's the
the
problem.
customer pay won't.
Yeah, the customer pay won't, and you don't want to keep the customer waiting. But I think Fix doesn't realize or see. I'm grouping everyone in together and not saying everyone is this way, but it doesn't see that money that can be made in that customer essentially that they're not.
This is where a lot of people don't agree with me. I was just matter of fact about those things. So after 3 days, and it only happened once every quarter at the most, but I just sublet it to that same brand in town. And I would just call the tow company and take it over to the Infinity store and have the Infinity store do it at their door rate.
I think that can work really well as long as you have a good relationship with them and they do good work when you sublet it, because that's the concern I think when you sublet it, getting the comebacks and all of that.
Well, the other concern is your technicians aren't getting paid. Your
Well,
service
yeah, that
advisors
too.
aren't getting paid. And so they lose their
And they're like,
minds.
what the heck? Yeah.
Right. So what typically would happen is if they got real backed up, or if we took in like 100 trade-ins over a weekend or something, then either myself or somebody else would stay with them sometimes till 10, 11 o'clock, because we would sit there and start telling them, hey, these cars are going somewhere else. And I'm going to take a whole truckload, or I'll take them down to an independent shop and just mark it up 30%, call it a day. Because at $50 a day per car, I can't have 20 cars that's $1,000 a day depreciating on my lot. And I think educating the technicians, but also being willing to do that. We would do a pizza party and I would order pizza for everybody. And it's not easy, but I needed to tell them, look, it's like a haircut, right? You can't go back in time and get them back. So I'm going to go get these cars serviced. I'd rather have you do it and you're here. But if we're not staffed, if we don't have the resources, the cars are still going to get serviced. If you want to stay here and get paid extra and stay here late with me, I'll stay with you and I'll approve the work with a flashlight as we're doing it, so they don't have to sit there and wait. Because I think that's one of the biggest crimes that I see as I look at it from both sides, is the waiting and not getting approval from a used car manager, or not empowering the internal advisor or the tech as to what the safety standards are, to where all this stuff is pre-approved. If it doesn't need anything else, then just go.
Yeah.
And a lot of the used car managers I need to touch it and feel it. And it's the exact same thing they approved on an appraisal. And there's nothing really to think about, but they need to be able to go. If I think about Ed Roberts' store, he's at less than 24 hours. And in most cases, like 8 hours
That's amazing.
total. And how does he do it? Because it's all about trust. His internal advisor trusts the used car director and vice versa. So he goes, he's not going to screw me and I'm not going to screw him. If I look at Joel Bassam up at Eastern's Automotive Group, he can do body work, like panels, like let's say it needs 2 panels on the front. His body shop is so efficient. He uses a competitive advantage that he can get pretty much anything done within 24 hours. And I'm talking full blown, like big, heavy body work.
Wow.
But I've never seen anything like it. He's got like 5 paint booths and there's an assembly line just going through all that stuff. And And it's the most efficient body shop I've ever seen, but they do it for internal, for speed. They don't actually mark it up. But it gives them a competitive advantage because they can buy cars that nobody else can buy because of their efficiency in fixed operations.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it just goes back to that trust between everyone, and everyone's just working together as like a well-oiled machine, and there's just like these are all the you just flow. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll
don't
say,
screw each other.
yeah, I'm sorry, what?
And don't screw each other.
Yeah.
That's what causes all the friction.
Yeah. So, yeah, how do you get rid of that? How do you get rid of people screwing each other on everything? I don't know.
Well, the only way that I figured out how to do that is through transparency. Wendell Hardy, who's the GM of that dealership now, he came to me and he kept because every salesperson, every used car manager, everybody's like, look at this RO. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important for everybody listening to understand, okay, yeah, so there's a $4,000 or $5,000 RO. Let's say you're at a $2,500 average internal PVR. That doesn't necessarily mean that parts or service is charging you too much. It just means that that's how much should have been deducted on the appraisal, and the customer should have participated in that. So just because, oh, you're paying $1,100, I'm paying $1,600, I must be getting screwed. That's absolutely not the case, because all it really matters is what's your parts internal margin, which should be 35% or higher, what's your labor rate, which should be door rate and shouldn't be discounted, my humble opinion, because I really don't think that matters. Now, I do think that parts should try to get the lowest available parts on a 10-year-old car and not go after a brand new OEM part on a $3,000 car. That's not the best business decision. And they should get paid more for that because it's extra work. But I think that I guess the only way I know how to do it is to share all that information and say, yeah, they're going to make 45%, but instead of a $600 water pump, you're going to get a $289 water pump. So would you rather have the $600 one at 35, or would you rather the $289 one at 45? Well, that one, obviously. Okay, well, that's what we're going to do. That's the standard. And then I would just show the financial statement in our composite. And I would say, look, with Southeast Toyota, here's the average internal markup. I did this with Wendell Hardy.
Yeah.
This is where we're at. This is the average internal markup. If it's 2 or 3 or 4 points, I mean, it is what it is, right? Because we want it to be better than everybody in every category. This is what the parts markup is. And that's what the margin is. Are either one of those out of line? No. Okay, so let's stop talking about that. And actually, I didn't even say that to Wendell. I just gave him a copy of the composite and told him to come back to me with a plan. And he came back and put it on my desk and he goes, okay, I get it. He goes, I went through there, tried to figure it out. You sent me on a wild goose chase. We'll fix it. We're going to get better at appraising cars.
Yeah, that's the good point. And I think too, it's not going to be 50-50. I think that's the biggest thing to look that you pointed out, I think, from what I gathered. And I think we could probably go on about appraisals because I think you have a lot to say about that whole process too, right?
Well, yeah, the average variance is like $1,600. I mean, let's just call this out so everybody knows this.
Yeah.
But the average, as we do this at scale, and some groups are better than others and more than that, but $1,600 is between what was estimated in recon and what the closed RO. I'm not talking about pack, and I'm not talking about internal gas and detail, just what was estimated. And half of it is because you missed stuff. Half of it is because you estimated the pricing of it, like $200 for tires when they're $400 a tire on a 21-inch wheel, or things like that people just don't know, or they don't know that with a heads-up display and a windshield, it's $3,000 instead of $500, and little things like that. So there's some coaching, reverse engineering that should happen, so that everybody's very tuned in to the fact that it's not the margin, it's the accuracy. And if you got rid of the $1,600 error on average per appraisal, I don't think everybody would be bitching about how much service is charging sales.
That's a great point. I think we're going to leave it at that because I think it's a very valid point. And I wanted to wrap up with asking you, because, with the new branding and just being a trailblazer in the industry, I wanted to get your perspectives on just, how you navigate the challenges of being someone that thinks outside of the box and you're very passionate about what you do. And I feel like it can be hard because sometimes it's hard to get people to see what you're seeing. So I think that's what I wanted to ask you is, how do you navigate that? Because I know for me, sometimes I get frustrated. I'm like, how are you not seeing what I'm trying to show you? Am I not saying it right? I don't know if you struggle with that or it's just me, but yeah.
No, I struggle with that really badly.
Okay.
And I think that I struggle with it still to this day on a daily basis. And it's probably one of my biggest challenges. And I have to come up with the realization. I'm not going to give you 1,000 different analogies, but
That's okay.
I think that in order to get people to see it, what I find the most, and a lot of times it's really, really hard. I got to try it like 4 or 5 different ways, and I got to keep saying the same thing, but using different analogies. And I think you've got to detach the person that you're talking to, internally, externally, or whoever, from the emotional attachment or bias that they have to that particular situation or the way they've been doing it for so long. Yeah. And you have to detach it and then use something like a Starbucks analogy or going into a bank or the evolution of Shopify or buying things and how they like to buy things in other parts of their life, right? Or could you imagine, the pain that you deal with when you go into a doctor's office and the fact that you filled out everything in the portal before you got there, but then they give you a clipboard with 25 pieces of paper when you show up and you're like, well, can't you just transfer that over? Well, yeah, but that system doesn't talk to this system. And it's the same struggles that we deal with in automotive retail.
Yeah.
And I think that in order to get the people in retail to see it, you've got to detach them and say these situations. And most people very quickly are like, oh my God, that's a nightmare. Well, walk me through how that's different than what we're doing here on the drive by having to ask them those questions again after they already put the appointment into X time. But now because it's not in the DMS, now we're going to ask them and we're going to start that Ferris wheel all over again. And they might not agree, but I think that's an easier way to get them to see it is to insert them in situations not automotive.
That's a great point. Yeah, I like that. That's very helpful and I didn't know that's something you struggled with. So it's cool to know because I feel like you share your perspectives very, very clearly. And it's a brave thing to do because sometimes people are going to disagree with you. And that's something
it's a daily occurrence, multiple times a day.
Yeah. Well, you managed it well.
Space.
It's actually entertaining to listen to too on like the clubhouses. So it's a good show. Not in like a bad way entertaining. Like
you can't have a good show without a little bit of conflict.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that. We can't just all be like, oh yeah, I agree. It's like, no, let's challenge this because there's still a problem. So
right.
Yeah. I loved interviewing you. It's been great. Is there anything that you want to add? I'm sure people can reach out to you on LinkedIn if they want to find you. We'll have links and everything, but
absolutely.
Anything you'd like to add to wrap up?
No, I appreciate you taking the time. And I think this parts to used car or sales analogy is one of these things that makes both sides of it a little less intimidating because it's basically the same thing, just with different words.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to keep on just translating it that way. And I'm going to learn as much as I can about use so I can continue to translate it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kaylee.
Thanks so much for joining me on the Trailblaze Your Path podcast. I hope you're leaving us inspired. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It really helps. Follow me on social media, check out our YouTube channel for more content, and remember, new episodes drop every other Friday. Keep blazing your own trail, and I'll catch up with you next time.